Racheli, do we have a go?
Yes, you're live.
Okay. Then do you want to say a couple of words?
Me? Yeah. So I'll first say a couple of words in Hebrew and then I'll come back to English, okay? So ברוכים הבאים כולם להרצאה שלנו עם סבסטיאן דה קסטל, סופר הפנטזיה הקנדי, מחבר סדרת כלא הקשף הנפלאה והמצחיקה, כותב בעיקר לנוער, כותב בעיקר פנטזיה, אנחנו ממש שמחים שהוא נמצא כאן איתנו היום, ואני בעוד שנייה מפסיקה לתפוס כאן את המסך ומשחררת. Welcome, Sebastien de Castell, the fantasy YA writer that comes from Canada. He actually don't come. It's nice to say he comes, but house in midnight, which is so nice of you to talk to us in that late hour. Nadav Almog, who you all know, will interview Sebastien, and now I'm just clearing the area and letting you do the magic you know how to do. Thank you so much for being with us today, Sebastien.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, so let's begin, and welcome to the magic of writing fantasy, a conversation with Sebastien de Castell. Hello to our viewers at home. After nearly 3 months of our writing competition and a month of writing challenge, Racheli and I at Nikudat Mifneh are happy to see you all at this final event. After the interview, we will declare the winners of this year's writing competition, so stay tuned. My name is Nadav Almog, and I will be hosting this event. I'm a literary editor specializing in fantasy literature and YA. I am also the manager of the typewriter, as well as the manager of the Almog Award. I have recently finished my PhD in English literature, also specializing on fantasy. Today, we are honored to have with us fantasy author Sebastien de Castell. Welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Okay. De Castell, for those of you who haven't checked already and don't know, De Castell is the best-selling author of the Great Coat series as well as the Spellslinger series. The latter has been translated into Hebrew by Castell Publishing House, and the 6th and final book in the series just came out last month. De Castell started his career as an archaeologist and left after his first dig. He also tried his luck as a teacher, a musician, an actor, and a sword-fighting choreographer. He is also a fencing enthusiast. His books have been translated to 15 languages and are some of the funniest and wittiest fantasy books you are likely to find. And after this intro, I want to welcome you, and let's begin.
Sure. I have to say 2 quick things. The first is, if you hear weird fighting sounds, it's because my 2 cats, when it gets late at night, if I'm still up, they have no idea why. And so they try to put on a big gladiator show all the time. So if you suddenly see fur flying behind me, that's my cats being a bit strange. And the second is, I didn't actually leave archaeology after my first dig. I left it after my first day on a dig. That is how much it turned out I hated archaeology.
Why? What happened there?
It was the end of my degree, and I studied archaeology. I joined the archaeology program for all of the best reasons, because I had seen Indiana Jones, and I thought that's what it was going to be like. And it turns out studying archaeology is wonderful because it's extremely fascinating. Practicing archaeology is like camping, but less fun. So if you really like camping and you really like toothbrushes, just digging in the dirt with a toothbrush, it's a terrific job, but it wasn't for me.
Mm-hmm. So this brings me to my first question. You seem to have been quite a busy guy before picking up the pen and the keyboard. So how did you end up becoming a writer, and why a writer at that?
I think it was a combination of things. I think, all of us want to be writers. I think we were talking before. You were saying that everyone in Israel wants to be a writer, or sees himself as a writer. I think that's true universally now, because it's such a wonderful form of expression, and because writing is one of the few art forms that really belongs to all of us. But I had never really been a writer at all. I think the only creative writing I'd done was one high school assignment for which I got a B minus, which to this day I think is a tremendous literary injustice. I think it deserved a B plus at least. But I was working in a rock and roll band. I was making my living playing Brown Eyed Girl and Mustang Sally, which if you're not familiar with those songs, try to imagine the most generic rock and roll songs that everybody plays. Playing those 3 times a night. And I was being in a cover band, and I was making almost no money playing these songs every weekend in this band. And I was being sued by the bass player. So creatively, my life was pretty bad. And I didn't know what I was doing. So I did what I always do when life gets complicated, which is I went to the library. And the beautiful thing about the library is you can walk in, you can have no idea about anything, what you want to do, how you're going to get through life, and you'll find something there. And I found a collection of tapes, cassette tapes, old cassette tapes. That was a course on how to write, taught by a very strange guy named Ralph McInerney, who wrote mystery novels. And so I followed these tapes every night. Finding a tape recorder wasn't that easy at the time. But, I'd listen to these tapes and I'd do what he said, and I wrote the worst novel imaginable. But it changed something inside me. I think when you write your first novel, you really alter your brain in the same way that when you run your first marathon, for example, you change your body. You don't run your first marathon in order to try to win. That would be ridiculous. You do it to change yourself into someone who can run a marathon. And it was the same with me with novel writing. And then it was my second novel. I wrote that novel. I was so happy, even though it wasn't a good novel, but it made me feel happy and I could do all these things better. And then I stopped writing for a while because I felt I was satisfied. And years later, I thought, I'll try something else just for fun. There's a thing every year called the 3-day novel writing competition, where people try to write a novel in 3 days. And usually they write about 10,000 words or 15,000 words. I wrote 45,000 words in 3 days, which I had no idea. I had no plan when I walked into it. And that strange book that I wrote in those 3 days became the first draft of Trader's Blade, which is what launched my career as a novelist. So I came about it through a slightly strange route.
Mm-hmm. But what drew you, from being cover musician to going to the library? Were books a part of your life or of your life prior to that point?
Well, certainly reading was. When I was quite young, my sister read to my older sister read to my brother and I, and read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the famous C.S. Lewis book. And I think I had a strange relationship to the book at the time, because even though I knew it was fiction, part of me felt like it was real. And that left a sort of a hunger in me to always be searching for Narnia, that you just are always looking for that feeling again. And I sometimes found it with reading, but the strange thing for me, and the thing that keeps me writing now, is that the closest I can get to that feeling that I had as a little kid listening to my sister read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is actually from writing. It's sometimes when I'm writing a novel where I suddenly feel like I'm not touching something literally real, but touching something that emotionally real. And that satisfies that urge for fantasy for me.
Mm-hmm. but did you have like aspirations of like growing up to be a writer?
Oh, I think I always wanted to. I'm always nervous answering this question because because I always wanted to see my name on a book, right? But that's a very different desire than when people actually desire to write. You know, it's the difference between somebody wanting to be a painter and somebody wanting to be famous for having a painting. And I was the latter, which I always think of as a less noble motivation. You know, if all you want is to see your name on a book, that's not a very noble reason to write. But it turned out to be, for me, that was part of it. I just always wanted to see that, and to be honest, that's still often true today. I love the feeling of a finished book, and so every time I get a new book that I've written sent to me by my publishers, I put it on my wall and I periodically can just stare at it, and I love that feeling. It's one of the greatest art forms for that. I would much rather be a novelist, for example, than a screenwriter, writing for movies, even though those guys make a lot of money. But it's just, they're always one little piece of things. Whereas whenever you write a book, even before it's published, when you just print out the manuscript, which I will often do, I have a first draft of a novel here that I had just printed and bound, just because when I hold it, it feels real to me. So I think that was what drew me to being a novelist in some ways, was wanting to create a story and have it be something physical.
Mm-hmm. Now, someone from the audience wanted to know if you can say that writing changed your life on other aspects.
Yes, I think I always tell people that I think writing a novel, especially for me, then the novel was always the form that attracted me. Writing a novel, I think, changes you in 4 ways. It changed me in 4 ways. The first is, I think it makes you smarter. It's very hard to get smarter after you leave high school, because high school, up until high school, you're doing very difficult things, right? High school is very difficult. You're reading hard books and things like that. Once you go to university, you get to make all of these choices. And so you get to go to what's maybe you like better or what might be easier for you. And then after university, you just get dumber, which is sort of what happened to me. But when you write a novel, to have to hold all of that in your head really changes the way you think. And it makes everything else seem easier, which was the second change that it made for me in my life, which was it made me much more confident. It's easier. I think it's easier to get a promotion by writing a novel than it is by trying to please your bosses, because I found that after I wrote a novel, when there was a promotion or a bigger job, I was really unafraid, because people don't hire you just to hire someone. They hire you because they need something done that's difficult, right? If they could just do it all themselves, they would do it all themselves, but they can't. And so someone would describe a very difficult job and it's very complicated, and I'd be like, yeah, that's complicated. It's not as hard as writing a novel, though. And so that confidence really helped in my life. The third thing it does is I think it makes you more interesting to other people. I used to tell high school students sometimes, because in North America, there's been this strange change where high school students think that you could never succeed as a novelist, right? They just assume that, it could never happen, which is strange. They all think they can be famous actors or YouTube or Instagram influencers, but they don't think they can be novelists. And I would always say to them, pretend for a minute that you're walking down the street and a lightning bolt strikes the ground in front of you, and you hear the voice of your creator, who says, for the rest of your life, you're going to work in a gas station or a petrol station. And that's it. No matter what you try, you're always going to work in a petrol station. And I always say, would you rather be someone who works in a petrol station and plays video games at night? Or would you rather be someone who works in a petrol station and writes novels at night? So it makes you just more interesting to other people, but it also makes other people more interesting to you. Before I wrote my first novel, if I would hear people, let's say in school, hear people gossiping, I would just think, oh, they're awful people and I hate them, or, whatever. And then, but once you write a novel for the first time, when you write characters, you start to realize that there's reasons why people do things, right? That for them feel very important, feel very genuine, maybe even feel very good. And so I found it much easier to go to parties and have small talk, just because I would find other people more interesting, because I understood from trying to write characters that there was a reason to everything they did and said. So it changed me in those 4 ways.
Mm-hmm. People are asking, how long did it take you to write that first draft, and what was it about? The first draft of the first book.
Oh, the first book. Oh, so it probably took about 2.5 months. And it was a mystery novel called Skeletons in the Cloister, which won't make sense unless you know the English idiom, which is skeletons in the closet is a common phrase here, which means, having bad secrets that you've kept hidden from people. And of course, a cloister is part of a monastery, of a religious site. So it's a play on words, skeletons in the cloister. And I say that only because my first agent, I remember when I sold my first book, which was Trader's Blade, and she said, "Do you have anything else?" And I said, "No, all I have is this horrible mystery novel I wrote years ago." And she said, "What's it called?" And I said, "Skeletons in the Cloister." And she said, "Oh, I can sell that." And I said, "No, but the book is terrible." And she said, "Yes, but it's a great title." Which teaches you a lot about publishing, that often people will think if you have a great title that really is impressive, you can probably fix the book. So it was an archaeological mystery. I was trying to get some use out of my archaeology degree.
Yes. Now you mentioned something about that you went to the library and you took out cassettes and you listened to this writing course. Did you do anything other than that to sort of improve your craft? Did you go to writing workshops or take a creative writing class?
I used to buy writing books, and I have stacks of books on writing. I have some here that, for example, that are quite good books, and I just have dozens of these books, and they do no good for me at all. I don't know what it's like for writers in Israel, but in North America, very often there is this divide between what they call the creative writing MFA, so Master of Fine Arts, so going to university to study creative writing, and then the sort of more gritty, how to write books and courses. And people will say, "Oh, those university master's degrees, they're all literary and they do nothing for you. They don't teach you how to write." And often literary people will look at the sort of the books and courses that you can just buy at your local bookstore, and they'll say, "Oh, that's not art." But in fact, none of it is all that potent or powerful unless it happens to speak to you. So writing, in many ways, and this is a tricky idea, so tell me if I don't explain it very well. You don't learn how to write, you discover how you write. And that's the problem, is someone can tell you, here is exactly, Stephen King could sit you down right alongside him and go, "I'm going to show you exactly how I write every single step of the way," right? I'll tell you every thought in my head, right? And it probably wouldn't work for you. Maybe 1% of what he said would actually work for you. But you might meet another writer who's terrible. You don't even like their writing, but they'll say, "Oh yeah, I just do this, and I drink this tea, and then I bang my head on a wall and spin around 3 times, and then I write," and you go, "Oh my God, that's exactly what I need," right? And so the process of learning to write, in many ways, is trying everything until you find the thing that it could be completely wrong, but it sparks something in your mind, right? That the process of learning to write is not so much about taking outside things in, but going inside yourself and finding what it is that makes you come up with ideas. And so all writing courses can be good, all writing courses can be bad. I tend to think that I didn't take the university courses. I sometimes think that in some ways they're better because even if they don't work, at least you learn how to read really well. You know, you learn to appreciate more sophisticated forms of fiction, whereas a lot of the sort of the writing books that you just buy from the bookstore, I think any book that tells you how to write based on Harry Potter and Star Wars is not serving you very well. Not because those aren't great stories, but because fundamentally those they're just so iconic, and it's not challenging you as much. So for me, it was a process of trying lots and lots of different things and then discovering what worked for me.
Mm-hmm. On to our next question. Many view writing short stories as a gateway to writing long form. Did you write other things before working on your first novel?
I wrote that very important high school poem that only got a B minus. Until this year, I almost never wrote short stories. Strangely, I never understood the form. I still don't. For me, it was always the novel. That's the form I understand. But then this year, I tried writing some short stories. Every once in a while, somebody will say to me, "We're publishing an anthology, or we have this magazine. Would you please contribute a story?" And I always say yes because I'm stupid. I should say no. I'm far too busy. But I always say yes, and then I panic. And so for the longest time, all my short stories were twist short stories. Like The Sixth Sense. But in a short story. There always had to be a trick, because if there wasn't a trick, then I didn't know what's the end of the story. And then this year, I started actually just writing short stories as themselves and taking more risks. And then I finally started to understand how valuable that can be, because a short story will let you explore something and you don't have to come out the other end with 80,000 word masterpiece, right? If all you do is spend 2 days or a day or a week writing a short story, and all you come out with is a line of dialogue that might be wonderful later on, it's still worth the time. So now I'm trying to make myself write short stories more. And actually, one of the ways that I wrote short stories, and I didn't know this would be good for me, is that sometimes if I was working on a novel with a friend, a good friend of mine and I, every few years, we try to write a novel together for fun. He would say to me something like, "Well, I don't understand what you want to do with this character. Let's each write a short story about them." And so I would do that, and then suddenly discover all these things. And in fact, with Spellslinger, the book deal that I got for Spellslinger was not based on the novel, but it was actually based on the short story that I wrote as an exercise for figuring out what the novel would be, because it was a fun short story. It had a trick in it, of course. In fact, it was called The Card Trick. And I had written it as part of this exchange with my friend so that we could understand what we were talking about. He said, "Show me how you want to see this character and how you want them to work." And when my agents were selling Spellslinger, we had this deal that wasn't a very good deal being offered to us for 4 books. It wasn't a lot of money. And it's very important when you're an author that you should try and get as much money as you possibly can from your publishers. That's because then it's good for all of us. Otherwise, the prices just get too low. So it wasn't a very good deal, but we were on the verge of taking it. And then my agent had this idea and said, "Oh, I'm just going to send this short story to this other publisher that they knew and say, you've got 3 days to make an offer. And this is what it's about." And they read it and loved it. And I ended up with an 8-book deal that was magnificent. And in fact, that short story, which is called The Card Trick, became the opening chapter of the 6th and final book in the Spellslinger series.
Yes.
So short stories can be very valuable for your career.
Yes. I thought you were referring to that scene, and it's like, I'm happy that I've read it, and I envy those who haven't read it yet, and who are about to read it and find it out. It's a great scene. Okay. Then he pretty much already told us about the road to publishing. No, he told us the road to publishing the first Pelslinger book. But could you tell us something about the road to publishing your very first book, getting the agent and all that?
Yes, the key to success, I think, as a writer is to marry a librarian. So I did that first. That was the most important part. And I'll tell you, so in 2006, which was when I did that 3-day novel writing contest. As I said, I didn't know what I was doing. I had these ideas that I developed while I was running, because I'm a very bad runner, and I get very bored. So I would tell myself bits of story, and which is a nice thing to do, by the way, if you're really stressed about writing, is that if you just tell yourself stories while you're running without planning to write them down, they all sit in the back of your head, and then when you're ready, they come together. So I had written that very first draft. It was too short. It was not that. It was fun, but not great. 6 years later, I decided, okay, you know what? Maybe I need to do something new. I like to change careers every 7 years or so. So I went, what shall I do? I'll become a famous novelist. That seems easy. That was how my mother used to think about these things. And so I wrote the second and third draft. The book became almost 3 times the size. And then I started querying agents. And the funny thing about, and this is something that's really, I always tell people, there's some really hard moments when you're trying to become a novelist. In other words, when you're trying to get published. Sending out query letters to agents is very difficult, because no matter how many times anyone tells you, and I'm going to tell everyone again, that it has almost nothing to do most of the time with the quality of your writing, right? The rejections, you'll just get the rejections, right? It still feels, every rejection feels like you've done something wrong. Like how could you be any good if this person rejected you? Nowadays, I just always try to remind people that all of the record companies in England rejected the Beatles, right? Until one said yes. And that's all that matters. You're looking for one. And so I was rejected by a bunch, and I thought, this isn't going to work. And I was in Toronto with my wife. She was at a conference, a library conference. And I was rewriting my query letter, which is another thing that is a total waste of time. If you try to write it well once, and then you just sort of have to trust it for a while. Because there are these services that will charge you $1,000 to write a query letter for you, and most of that doesn't matter. Mostly what happens is they look at the first page of your manuscript, and it's either good right off the bat or it's not. And it's often quite easy to tell if you have a good opening sentence or not, and then a good opening paragraph, a good first page, a good scene. So, but my wife came back from this dinner that she had that had some publishers around, and she said, "Oh, good news! I met with this publisher, the head of Penguin for Canada, and he said his wife is starting a literary agency." Sorry, that's the cats attacking each other. She's starting a literary agency, and they're looking for people. So he said to send your manuscript, and I thought, this is a waste of time. And so I didn't do anything. And then he actually sent her an email 2 days later saying, "Oh, here's the name of my wife and her email address, and remind Sebastien to send the manuscript." And I still said, that doesn't matter. And then she wrote and said, "Looking forward to seeing the manuscript." And so I sent it. And then 3 weeks later, I got this voicemail, which I think I still saved somewhere. I don't think I've ever deleted it. where she said, and she's British, and it started, and I thought, oh, this is horrible for the first 15 seconds, because it started with, hello, Sebastien, this is Heather Adams of the HMA Literary Agency. I've read your manuscript all the way through, and I love it. I'd love to represent you. So it's very British. The first part all sounds like it could be a declaration of war. And then all of a sudden there's the good news. And something I didn't understand, because it always seemed to me that trying to get agents through meeting someone or going to a convention or a festival, it always seemed like, why would that work? Why would that be any better than just being in the what we call the slush pile, where everybody's manuscripts, they look at one page, throw it away, one page, throw it away, and I didn't understand until I met lots of editors and agents that first of all, when we imagine the slush pile of manuscripts, this pile of 1,000 manuscripts, 900 of them are from people who probably can't spell the first word, like that they're often quite, strange. And then a lot of the rest are from people sometimes who don't make a lot of sense. And so if somebody just even sees that you are well-spoken and coherent, that will help. And the strangest thing about this meeting, this dinner that my wife was on, it was when she told this publisher about the hundreds of fantasy novels that we had on shelves in our garage, that he got excited. And I didn't know that for him, meeting a fantasy writer who genuinely read lots of fantasy books, that actually was a big plus. To me, it would seem obvious, but actually it's not. And so the lesson there is, one, my books sell pretty well, and I've been really lucky in my career. But I was rejected by every single agent until I found one agent. Right. And all you need is one good agent. And the second is that you can't prejudge what it is people are looking for. Like, I always think they're just looking for compelling writing, but sometimes I see this all the time. I'll meet an agent, I'll talk to an agent, and I'll say, how's it going? Are you finding interesting clients? And they'll say, oh, I keep reading these great manuscripts, just fantastic writing, but I have to reject them because I already have an author who does this kind of fantasy or this kind of science fiction. So sometimes it has nothing, well, most of the time it has nothing to do with you as the writer. Anyway, when I first spoke to my agent, Heather, because I'm a very arrogant person sometimes, she was lovely, and she said, we'll try to see how things go. And I said, oh, take all the time you need, but I want a book deal in 3 months, and I want it to be for $100,000. And she said, well, that's not very realistic. It usually takes 18 months. And I said, well, you've got 3 months, and then we'll see how it goes. And I was just being stupid. And then I swear, 3 months to the day later, my wife and I were on a cycling trip, and I get this email, and it's from Heather, and she's almost confused, and she says, we have an offer. And the problem was, it was for 4 books, right? So a four book deal. And the problem was that the email, it looked like it's at $100,000 for the 4 books, except that it was written as 100,00, and I couldn't tell, so 10 was clearly missing, and I couldn't tell where the comma was supposed to be. So I didn't know whether she was saying $100 or $10,000 or anyway. So once we got it cleared up that it was indeed, for the $100,000 for 4 books, which was just, I don't know why that number mattered to me. And Canadian dollars are worth less than American dollars, by the way. So it's slightly less impressive, but it was still what I call the coffee barista. I don't know if you use this term in Israel, barista.
Yeah.
A barista. Yeah. The person who works at the Starbucks and gives you your coffee. So I refer to it as the barista level of success. If all I did was write 1 book a year, I would earn as much as a barista. And so for my next contract, I wanted to make what I call dental hygienist money, the person who cleans your teeth, and then after that, plumber, and then accountant. And so that's how it happened.
Cool. Next question. In what way, if at all, do you think your professional experience influenced your writing?
I think the great thing about being a novelist and a writer is that everything you do, of course, influences your writing. Everything that you do that touches on the human experience. Just so that I don't give another 4-hour long answer, I'll say very briefly that because I used to choreograph sword fights for the theater, that taught me about the fact that when you write an action scene, when you write a fight scene, that it has to contain a story inside of it, right? You can't just have people fighting, because if it's the theater, Shakespeare, for example, most of his plays, all they say is, they'll have two characters come in with swords and stomp at each other on stage, and then it just says they fight, and that's it. And then the dialogue begins again. And often when I was choreographing a scene, the director would take it to that point and go, they fight, and go, okay, I'm going for coffee. And they would leave. And then I was supposed to work with the actors and develop a fight scene. And then they would come back when there was dialogue, and I would have no idea what we needed to do. And so you have to build a story into each fight, or build a story. Even imagine you're writing a car chase, right? In movies, we see car chases all the time, and mostly they're just spectacle. They don't do anything. But I always think, imagine you're trying to write a car chase, but now you have to write it so there is a story inside the car chase, and it has to be told just with the action. And you have to tell a story of two characters who are different, who want different things, who do things different ways, who are in conflict, but only with the car chase. And that's what I learned, and that's what I bring into my writing.
Okay. And aside from your professional experience, first, do you yourself read YA?
I do. I find it harder and harder to read it now, and in part because I'm finding more and more that what we call YA is no longer informed by or written for teenagers. It's becoming more and more informed by and written for adults who just want to read something that they think will be simpler. And that's a very dangerous proposition, because teenagers are often more sophisticated readers than most adults. And that's because they are in school, they're learning to read very difficult texts. If most of us went back to our literature classes in high school, we would struggle to get through them because you had to read the hard things, right? And so when the literature starts to become what we say in English, dumbed down, you try to simplify because it's written with all these presumptions, then it becomes less interesting to me to read. And so I like things, it sounds strange because I'm a 53-year-old man, but I find young adult literature more interesting when it feels like it's genuinely written about and for teenagers, because they are going through a very important and interesting part of life. Like I always say that young adult literature, the thing that makes teenagers different from 12-year-olds and makes them different from 20-year-olds is that they are coming to see that the world is unfair and they don't accept it, right? When you're 8 or 10 or 12 years old, you still think that the world is basically fair because your parents love you and they try to make you think that they're bringing you into a decent world. And there can be evil, but evil is a distortion of the proper good world that we live in. And when you're an adult, you often think, yeah, the world is crap, people are terrible, but you just sort of accept it. But when you're a teenager, you rebel against it, right? And I love reading those stories of people who are discovering that the world is unfair, and they don't just accept it. Sometimes I'll be at a conference and people will say things, I'll be horrified. I'll be on a panel of young adult authors, and people ask what makes young adult literature young adult, and they'll say, and they'll start talking about, well, teenagers, they think their love is the biggest love in the world. They're all hormonal and this, and I always say, I try to write young adult literature not as if teenagers are unformed adults, but as if adults are teenagers past their best before date. You know, that the true apex of humanity is when we're teenagers, because that's when that's when love is so big, right? And that's when fear is so big, and uncertainty and all those things. And so that's what I look for when I'm reading it, and that's what I try to do when I write it.
Okay. You said that you appreciate YA books that are actually meant for young adults, but it occurs to me that Farius Perfaks drinks and gambles and swears and smokes, and later on Kellen himself also gambles, and it occurs to me that these are themes that might not be deemed YA. So how did you get that to work?
Well, so first of all, I think teenagers drink and smoke and gamble. I hope not to shock anyone's sensibilities, but all of those things that we think are inappropriate for teenagers are often the things they're going through. I don't think I ever thought about sex as much as an adult as I ever did as a teenager, right? Like that's when it's scary. And sometimes that's when it's dangerous. That's when it can really alter your life. And so I think it's important to sometimes write about those things. Now, I don't write one of the interesting things about young adult literature, certainly in the English language right now, is that if you write contemporary young adults, a young adult set in our world in the present, you can talk about difficult issues. You can talk about sex and violence and drugs, because we know teenagers are having to deal with those things. It's harder when you're writing fantasy. And that again is because there's this expectation that fantasy is going to be in this kinder, better world. But I'm not really interested in writing about the kinder, better world. I like to write about good people dealing with a difficult world. And so, but also what often fascinates me is because you mentioned the various smokes and drinks and gambles. Those are not very big crimes in a world where people consider genocide and slavery and all of these other things. And so sometimes I think it's important to introduce those subjects just to set the appropriate scale, to remind people that there are worse things.
Yes, but the challenge, I think, is to get these things past your agents and the publishers.
Yes.
So that you need to get their approval to submit this with, these foibles. I don't know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What's interesting is that and for everyone that is writing, that is here watching this as writers, is I have found that changes even over the course of the Spellslinger series, which I wrote, published. It was published 2 books a year in English, so 6 books in 3 years. And in fact, now with the 2 new Farius Perfaks books, which are also coming out in Hebrew next year, I think. That's all in the scope of 4 or 5 years, those books. And I have seen the attitudes of editors change over that time. So certain words, like swear words that I could use in the first book, suddenly in the 4th book were being flagged. And I would have to argue to keep those words. So it does depend on the time period. One of the interesting things is that Soulbinder, which is the 4th, I think I have it here. The cover is similar in Hebrew, but so this book has a gay character who's not who it's not a very important role in the story. He's a nice guy. That's all. He's helpful to Kellen. There's no sex between men in the story or anything like that. He just happens to be gay. And my Russian publishers were afraid that they were going to run afoul of Russian law by publishing it that way. and they asked for permission to remove those scenes with the character. And because you can, in Russia right now, it's safe to have a gay character who's evil, but not a gay character who's good. And I said, no, we can't change. I'm not changing that. I'll pay the fine if you want. And they said, well, we can't agree for you to pay the fine because that's a conspiracy. So every copy of this book in Russian has an 18 plus sticker on it, meaning you have to be 18 years old to buy it. So next to the pornography in a Russian bookstore is this book, which, by the way, I think increased the sales quite a bit. But the point that I'm making about that is that to tell the rest of the story, in this book, in Queenslayer, the fifth book, there is a scene of sexual violence. It's very restricted. It's very tame. It used to be much worse. And my editors kept saying, can you tone it down, tone it down, and eventually they wanted it toned down to the point where I said, no, if we're toning it down more than this, I'm taking it out because I'm trying to say something to young men in this story, right? They have to be aware of our own capacity to do bad things, and you have they need to be aware of that. And so, but they were almost at the point of cutting it out. And they're very, but because they wanted to protect kids. Well, the Russian government also wants to protect kids. They just think that the way that you protect kids is by not talking about gay people, right? So sometimes we think the way that you protect kids is don't talk about sexual violence or don't talk about drugs. And they think the way to protect kids is don't talk about gay people. We always think we're trying to protect people, but but that's a very dangerous proposition because you have to be awfully sure that you're 100% right. And so what I found, to maybe answer your question more directly and more succinctly, is you have to negotiate with your editor, and you always have to, as the writer, decide, is this integral or is it not? There's lots of things an editor will ask to remove or change where I won't fight it at all because I look at it and go, is this important to the story? Yes, it is. No, it isn't. There's a use of a word, there's a swear word in English, which is a bitch, which is a bad thing to say of a woman typically. Technically, it means a female animal. And the squirrel cat, because he's a squirrel cat in the book, he's an animal himself, sometimes uses the word. And nobody cared about it until like the fifth book. And then all of a sudden, tastes changed. And I had to decide. And so there were 3 times it was used in the book, and 2 of them I said don't matter. And this one I said, no, this one really matters. And so sometimes as a writer, you'll have to contextualize it, but that's always the way it is. It's very, very rare in my experience as a writer, certainly with the publishers I've worked with over the years, and that's a lot of publishers. It's very rare that they will say, no, we don't care what you think as the author, we're changing this. They're always saying, here's the problem. And then it's your job to find a way to either fix that, to make it work, or to say, well, if I can't make it work, is it really as important as I think it is?
Okay, I would like to move on to the next question, which is Kellen, the protagonist of the Spellslinger series, is like an inverse hero. Instead of having special powers, he's the only one who does not in his environment. How did you come by that idea, and why? He's like the chosen one that, because he's chosen, does not have powers.
He's, I think, so I'm Canadian, so we never think we're number one. We're always happy to be number 2 at everything. Second largest country in the world. The only thing we're number 1 at is we have the best looking prime minister. But everything else we're second best. So for me, I love stories like Harry Potter. I think I love those books. I think they're wonderful. There's lots of books like that I love. There's all the fantasy I read when I was a kid involved the chosen one who seems like an ordinary young person who discovers that they actually have great powers and a great destiny, and they're secretly rich and their parents love them more than everyone else. That was not my experience as a teenager. And when it was time to write the Spellslinger, the hardest part is, and I'm going to steal from a question that you may or may not get to about research. The hardest part is to go inside yourself and remember, what was it really like to be a teenager? Now, teenagers, like adults, are all different. We have different experiences. But my teenage years were not about discovering that I was the super important, right? I always say, I remember the day I was at my school before the bell rang for the first class, and I was watching my fellow students come in. And I thought, when I was looking at them, you know what? I'm not the smartest person in my school. I'm not the strongest person. I'm not the most athletic. I'm certainly not the best looking. I don't even have the best personality. And I am not special in any way. And I went to my family that night and said, I feel strange. I feel like I'm not really special. And usually the people in your life will say, no, of course you're special. You're the most special little boy ever, My family didn't. They said, yeah, you're not that special. So what are you going to do about it? And so that was very fortunate for me, because it taught me that you have to earn your specialness, right? You can't wait for it to be given to you. If you just keep waiting, people will sometimes say, oh, everyone has a secret talent, you'll discover, you just wait for it. I don't think that works. And I think as a teenager, I think it's dangerous to be told to wait to discover how wonderful you are. I think it's better to do what Kellen has to do, which is make hard choices and try to take the things that they are good at and put them together in interesting ways.
Okay. The question of humor also comes to mind, which I think is like a very important part, at least for me, in my experience reading the Spellslinger books. There's some of the funniest in the genre. I mean, when I read them, I literally laughed out loud, having people look at me like, what's wrong with you? How do you make the humor in your books work?
You tell your Hebrew translator, this book is incredibly funny in English, so you better make it funny in Hebrew, and then hope that they can do it. I think, no, I'm saying that because, of course, I can't read Hebrew, so I don't know, but translating humor is incredibly hard. So what you've really told me right now is that the translator for Keter, who's translated the books, must be incredibly good at their job, because it's incredibly hard to translate humor. I think that I try to use humor as a way to show a different viewpoint of a situation, which is, I think, what humor does for us, right? It puts a mirror up to something, but it does it in a way that's maybe that's slightly unpredictable. In the Spellslinger books, the humor is mostly coming from Rikus, the talking squirrel cat, because he, being a squirrel cat, which is an imaginary animal, is free to view the world, is free to view the world differently from us, and is free to comment on it differently from us. So very often, one of the beautiful things, by the way, for all writers, when you have a talking squirrel cat in your book, they can say things that humans aren't allowed to say. And so it's always more funny, because in part, you have a character who's saying things that shouldn't be said, and that you couldn't allow your main character to say. It's very difficult to make your main character the really funny one, right? They usually have to be the butt of the joke, or what we call in North America, we call the straight man, the person who's just doing things normally and setting it up so that the other character can be the funny one. But the easiest way to find humor in your books, or to bring humor out in your books, is to have a character who has a higher level of freedom in how they see the world and express themselves than the other characters. Some people do it with a character who's always drunk. You know, if you imagine a character who's always drunk, they can say horrible things, but they need to be truthful things, right? They need to say the thing that nobody else wants to say, but is true. And that's when the humor both feels funnier, but also feels more relevant to the story.
Mm-hmm. But it's not just Rikers. I mean, Kellen himself is like a very good source of humor, especially when he seems to, I don't know, maybe like Deadpool, like breaks the fourth wall. And it's like, you'd think that in this situation, I would like shoot this ball of fire and everyone would burn. And then I lost consciousness.
Yes.
So it seems to be like very funny, but also not afraid to make fun of himself.
Yes, I think it's easier. It's easier to write a character a main character who is self-deprecating, where they make themselves the butt of the joke too, than if they're funny, like more clever than other people. The breaking the fourth wall, you know, when Kellen starts to tell us things, part of that, I like doing that because I think that an interesting way to write is to ask yourself, not just who is telling the story, right? The main character is narrating the story. Who are they telling it to, right? Mm-hmm. Because the more that I think of Kellen as telling us the story, you know, telling it to a person, the more I tend to have him break the fourth wall and say, you would think this would happen, but that's not what happened. Because when we tell each other stories, that's what we do. One of the things that, you know, I don't know if you have this term, cinematic writing. People talk a lot about cinematic writing. It's because movies make a lot of money. And so we all want to be like making movies and books. But cinematic writing can actually be very dull because it's very impersonal. It's told through a camera lens. And sure, there's lots of effects and it's very vivid. But the power of the written word in part is having a sense of actually telling the story to someone. And so when you're writing, if you write a little bit almost as if you're writing a letter to someone, or you're telling your friend a story that happened, you'll tend to find funnier ways to say things.
Mm-hmm. Now, since you put in humor in your books, I think it puts your narrative in danger of becoming like comic. Mm-hmm. So how do you strike a balance between the humor and the fantasy and the suspense to make it like it's still a serious fantasy story?
Yeah, every writer, when they're writing a book, has to decide on the level of realism is probably the wrong word, but the level of immersion, I would say, of are you telling a story as if we're really in it? You know, if you write a fairy tale, right, and lots of fantasy novels now are retellings of fairy tales, and they're written in a fairy tale voice. Everything's very distant. But if you're writing something that feels very personal, then it has to feel like it could be happening. Humor never removes us from the real. It doesn't remove us from the moment. Humor is a way that human beings deal with reality. And so where I try to use humor is as a solution to a problem the character is facing. In other words, this is terrible, this situation is horrible. I don't make the situation funny. I make them use humor to survive the situation, right? It's you know, imagine we could be in a car together and it's sinking in the river and we can't get out and we think we're going to die. We could say something funny then, just to keep ourselves from panicking. And it would be funny, but it wouldn't take away the drama. The thing that you have to be careful of, and that I try to be very careful of, is using humor in a way or at a time that diffuses drama. That's the danger. And for those who watch the Marvel movies, the superhero movies, they sometimes make this mistake. I love a lot of those movies, but sometimes you'll have this moment where it's at the third three-quarter mark of the movie when things are darkest, or the hero has to like dig down deep, and then they'll make a stupid joke, and that completely breaks the drama. There's a good example I think I saw someone use about Doctor Strange, one of the Marvel movies, where there's all this danger and death and destruction, and he puts on the cloak, and the cloak sort of touches him and he bats it away. And they make this joke that cuts this tension, because what you needed at that moment was the continuous tension of what this person is going through, of the knowledge of what they're about to face. So a lot of it has to do with timing. You can have as much humor as you want, but you have to think about the timing of it. There are some times where it's a solution for the character. It's the character making. I would put it this way. You want it to feel as if it's the character making a joke, not the author telling a joke. Right?
Wow, that's an interesting distinction.
Yeah.
And are these the things that you have in mind while writing?
I think so. My favorite way to write, and I can't always write this way because sometimes I lose it, is that all I'm thinking about, all that's going through my head is emotional impulse. I want this moment to feel tense or angry or funny or scary, and I'm trying to feel those emotions, and then just typing what comes out of my head. You trust your mind to follow your heart, right? That's what I'm usually doing. And so I'll go, I feel this tension, I feel like this character was gonna, I want the character to say something funny. Usually, very often my characters, when they say something funny, it's to help the other character deal with the moment. And so then I'll try to do it that way. I never sit down and consciously go, okay, what would be a good joke here? I usually, and it's very easy, by the way, and I'm guilty of this, when you find a very specific joke or a type of joke to reuse it. So I can always, if I need to, have Rikus say something funny, right? Because there's like 3 or 4 types of things he might say. Sometimes it's sexually inappropriate, sometimes it's about violence, where he talks and he's very violent, the way he describes things.
I take 2 eyes, you take 1.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he always wants to eat eyeballs, which is why it was so important to me that sometimes you actually see him eating eyeballs. Because again, I want it to be funny, but I also want you to realize that he is a wild animal. He is dangerous, right? So it's finding those balances. But most of that, it's funny because we can talk about it, and I love talking about it, because it sort of makes it intellectualized, which is good. But as the writer in the moment, you can't intellectualize it. You have to just keep digging deeper and deeper inside yourself until something comes out. And that's what I'm usually trying to do. Because if I try too hard to go, okay, it's been 42 pages since we had a squirrel cat joke, I should put one in here. I can do it. It will work, but it will never be a discovery. And remember, it's like I was saying earlier, the process of learning to write is actually the process of discovering your writing. So yeah, that's how I try to do it. But I'm certainly glad you found the books funny, because I never know for sure whether people, the problem is, I don't know if other writers find this, but especially if you write any funny jokes and stuff, you start to try them out all the time, right? Like, because you're always searching for something that's kind of funny. And so my poor wife, is constantly around me when I'm trying to say something funny, and I'm just sort of looking to see if she's going to laugh or not. So she gets so people in your life get subjected to your very bad first draft jokes.
Okay. Now, speaking of your wife, not a very good time, but Spellslinger features many strong and talented women. We have Shala, Kellen's sister. We have Farius, Meresan, if this is how you pronounce her
Marasan,
name.
yeah.
And even Kellen's mother. Kellen himself is not a typical male hero. He doesn't rely on power or strength to solve his problems. Even when he grows up, he doesn't suddenly become like kung fu fighting cowboy. In fact, he's often humbled in face-to-face combat and confrontations. Do you think of your books as feminist or like advanced in that regard? Is that a consideration?
It's never a consideration when I'm writing. I don't think of my writing as feminist in nature. I don't think of myself. When I grew up around feminists, and they were either academics or activists. So they were people who either knew a great deal or took a great deal of risks for the causes they believed in. And I'm neither one of those. So that's why I vote in favor of feminist causes, but I don't think of myself as a feminist. I certainly don't think of my writing as particularly feminist. I do what I try to do, and what I think is the easiest thing to do for writers is to try to write every character as if they're just a human being, as if they're just another aspect of yourself, if you will. And then you can choose to deal with issues of gender or sexuality if you want. But I almost never do. There's almost no character in my books where you couldn't switch their gender and it would still work just fine. In fact, Farius is an unusual name for a woman. And it's an unusual name for a woman because originally Farius was going to be a man. I had this vision in my head, because Farius is a bit of a cowboy kind of character and, lanky and come in on the horse and say funny things, and there's this famous actor called Sam Elliott, who's one of the coolest looking human beings alive. So if you ever look up Sam Elliott, you'll see he's got the coolest voice in the world. And I always thought, I'm going to write this character named Farius Parfax, and he's going to be like Sam Elliott. But when I sat down to start writing, I realized, well, that's a strange thing to do because the mentors, the people I sort of looked up to when I was a teenager, when I was Kellen's age, happened to be women. That's who was around me, right? And so I thought, well, why does it have to be that a young man is mentored by an older man? Like, what's wrong with having a female mentor? And so I let Farius be Farius. But I made her a woman, and it's very rare that Farius brings in issues of gender in that way. In fact, she's almost the opposite because she says to Kellen, you're going to have to figure out how to become a man. And he says to her at one point, why do you keep talking about, I have to be a man, like you're a woman? And she's like, well, because that's what you are. You're going to have to figure out how to become that and deal with all of your problems. And so, but the key, I think, for all of us when we're writing, and the thing that I often fail to do in my first draft, and then have to do to make the characters work, is all your characters should have agency, right? All your characters should be doing things by choice, and therefore you have to ask, why are they making those choices? And the more you do that, the more your characters will all feel, when you say strong female characters, it's funny because we never say strong male characters, right? When we say strong female characters, what we really mean a lot of the time is female characters who are actually characters, right? They have motivations, right? So you sort of named four, right? Shala is absolutely motivated by believing that she's the best, that she needs to be the best, that her family is the best, and all of that, right? Whereas Farius is motivated by this notion that you have to try to find a way to do good in the world, and it's very complicated to do good, that the world is far more complicated than it appears. And so her decisions are based on that. And the same is true of Marasan. And even Kellen's mother seems very passive in the book. And in earlier drafts, she probably would have been a very passive character. But by asking myself, in what way is she making decisions in this book, right? Because sometimes we just see her supporting her husband. so I had to go, okay, but why is she supporting her husband? How is she doing something that's supporting her husband, but maybe not the way he wants? And that's where you find the little bits of tension between them. And then all of a sudden the character starts to feel alive. And so always asking that question, I always say, I'm a humanist by nature, and humanism, like the old Renaissance humanism, had basically two central beliefs. One, all human beings have agency, so we all have free will. And two, all human beings have dignity, right? There's an inherent dignity. If you give all your characters agency and dignity, I think it's easier to make them feel stronger and more interesting, regardless of gender or sexuality or race or any of those other issues.
But I think when I speak of like strong female characters, it also seems to me that female characters like Ferris Fairfax, like Melisande, like Kellen's mother, and to some extent even Shala, seem to be more devoted or focused to the truth or the important stuff, whereas even strong male characters such as Kellen's father and other sort of politicians and whatnot, they seem to mess around with things which are not that important. Do you understand what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
They play around this game of power, but they don't really go deep into the real sense of things. And this is especially seen when Melisande is concerned.
Yeah, they're less. I think it's fair to say that the male characters in Spellslinger are less reflective. They spend less time asking themselves or thinking about why they're doing the things they're doing, and that itself was not intentional, right? So that's just, sometimes you're writing and you're thinking of people a certain way, and in this case, I think the central dynamic for me of that book was Kellen and Farius and Rikus. And so all other characters are kind of orbiting them. If Kellen, and I guess what I found was when I was writing Kellen's father, because Kellen so much wants to be his father, I needed his father to be more impenetrable, right? Because if we knew what his father was really thinking, what really motivated him all the way through, then Kellen would know. And so I needed Kellen to be blind to that, which means I have to have the reader be blind to that. And actually, you'll notice as you go through the series, one way to read the series is as the gradual unfolding of his father's personality, right? There's a moment in the fourth book where he sees his father and he sort of outwits his father or something. And he kind of assumes his father's going to want to kill him or hate him or whatever. And his father's actually proud of him. And it's the first time his father apologizes for something he did in the first book. And so he's a tragic character in a way, right? He has a lot of hubris, but I needed that to be opaque. And I think maybe, and you're the first person who's raised this, so that's why I'm kind of thinking on the fly, because I hadn't really thought about it this way before. But I think because Kellen himself, and this was true of me as a 15, 16-year-old, is trying so hard to figure out how to become a man, that I needed the male figures in his life to be impenetrable.
I think even if you look at the character of Rikus, then Rikus's voice of reason is his mother.
Yes. It's true. I think okay, you win. Maybe it is a feminist text, but it was completely unintentional. I swear. It's true that there's a degree to which, but that's partly because I needed Rikus Rikus is so different from Kellen, but I needed him to have some of the same problems as Kellen, you know? Because the trinity of Kellen and Farius and Rikus is slightly Freudian, right? Kellen is the ego, right? He's the one making the decisions, or he's the consciousness. Farius is the super ego who's trying to show him a better path, and Rikus is his id who just wants to eat and kill and have sex.
Okay, so we're coming close to the end of our time. I would, however, like, if it's okay, to go through a few additional questions.
Yes, my pleasure.
Okay.
Yes.
So, how do you stand out in such an overflooded and competitive market? I mean, the YA market is completely blown out of proportion in the last few years.
So sometimes there's two ways or two or three ways that books stand out. I'll try to be really fast in this. One is when you're writing a premise that other people haven't necessarily written very much, or that most people aren't aware of. So in the case of Spellslinger, I'm not saying that it's the most original premise in the world, but it felt original at the time to have a story that's specifically not about the chosen one, that it's specifically the person who discovers that they're not special. He's the anti-Harry Potter. And people had read a lot of Harry Potter, and they'd read a lot of books that were like Harry Potter. And so having the character who has to survive on tricks rather than power, sometimes that can help. Another is writing about kinds of people who don't always get very well represented. So for example, and this will sound odd, but young adult fantasy is almost all female protagonists. Right, because women read more than men. Certainly in English, men don't read nearly as much, and boys, they'll basically read until they're about 12 or 13, and then a lot of the times they stop. And so, a lot of the times that means publishers will assume that girls don't want to read about male protagonists, so let's give them all girl protagonists. But that's not actually true. Girls will read about all kinds of protagonists, and boys will read about all kinds of protagonists. So sometimes it's having a character that's not the same sort of character everyone else has had. But both of those things are very hard to predict. So as a writer, it comes down, this is the thing, I think, is the more true your writing is, the more extreme your writing is, the better chance you have. And what I mean by extreme is not it's the most violent or the most sexual or the most pure or the most whatever. It's that whatever it is that you love, that you are trying to write about, that you write that as extreme as you can. And I say this because a lot of writers, the worst thing that's happened to us, I think, as writers in the last 15 years, is that we've become so much more exposed to criticism, not negative criticism, but people talking about books. It's, it doesn't happen in newspapers anymore. It happens on Goodreads or social media, but it's everywhere. And it's all these people telling you, what are they telling you all the time? They're saying, oh, Twilight is so awful. What a stupid, sparkly vampires. What a bad idea. Sparkly vampires, I don't read Twilight. It's not my thing, but sparkly vampires were brilliant. You know how I know they were brilliant? Because millions of readers loved them, right? And so if you start writing your book, your story, and you love sparkly vampires, but you go, oh, that's so, it's been done, or, and so you pull it back because you want to seem more sophisticated, you'll write something nobody wants to read. If you love sparkly vampires, you write vampires that sparkle 10 times more than the ones in Twilight. Be as extreme as you can about what you love. And chances are you will speak to all those people who, instead of just talking about books and criticizing books, actually read and love books.
Okay. How do you deal with the reception of your books? Do you read or watch book reviews?
I just think of people criticizing my books, and I try to imagine strangling them. No, some I'll, usually I'm pretty lucky. Most reviews have been very positive and people are quite nice, and sometimes they hate my books, and that's fine too. But there's one kind of review that people always talk about that they're worried about, which is what we call the 1-star review, right? That a reader puts up on Goodreads and give it 1 star, and they write like 4 pages of why it's the worst book ever. And I always tell other writers, you need to remember something. When you read a book and you don't like it halfway through, most of us put it away. If you read a book and you get all the way through it and you hate it, you just throw it away. You don't write 4 or 5 pages about it, right? The only time you do that is when there's something that you're dealing with internally that makes you angry and sad, and it's been bothering you for so long, not since you read the book, probably years. And you read this book and suddenly it frees you. It gives you a focal point, and you spend all this time writing about how horrible the book is and how lousy the author is, but really you're just getting all of this pain out of your body. So when you get one of those 1-star reviews where they say yours is the worst book ever written, just know that you have helped that person to do something that they very much needed to do. You've probably helped them more than all the people who love your books. And so that's what I try to do, is I try to remind myself that I'm not the only person who exists in the world. And that when I see a review, the review isn't just a reflection of me, it's someone else expressing themselves and expressing their own feelings. And that's fine.
So you don't challenge them to duels with the swords behind you?
No, I would never challenge them to a duel. I would shoot them in the back. It's much safer.
Okay. Could you tell us about marketing your books and what you yourself do to promote them?
I do very little to promote them, in part because I really believe that publishers need to be responsible for that. Sometimes that's not a good thing to say out loud. But publishers have all of the keys to promoting and marketing a book, right? Because they have the connections for publicity, they have the budget, they can, if they do advertising, it can work. I see some authors, they have a debut novel and they'll think that you know what, maybe I should take out some ads. They'll take out some Facebook ads or some Amazon ads to try to get people to buy the book. But when you do that, you're getting 1/5 of that money. So it financially doesn't make sense. It makes sense for the publisher to do it because they get a bigger percentage of that money. The thing that you can do to promote books as an author or the thing that I try to do, is to be present for the readers. So I don't post a lot on Twitter, for example, but when somebody says something to me or about me on Twitter where I think they want me to respond, I always do. I reply to every piece of fan mail. I reply to every direct message on Twitter. I try to hit like when people say something nice, is to just be available. And sometimes that will work. I do interviews when I'm asked to do interviews and things like that, but I would never, as an author, try as a traditionally published author, I would never try to take on the role of marketing, because I can never do it as well as they can do it. I'm just not in that position.
Okay. What would be your tips for those of our viewers at home who want to write YA?
Dig deep inside yourself. Don't write as an adult looking backwards. Try to remember what it felt like to be in that situation, and then the dramatic situations. So for example, the first time you asked someone out on a date and they rejected you and everybody else found out about it. Don't judge that from the standpoint of an adult. Go back into that moment. Ask, how do I feel? And write about those feelings, about what it feels like at the time. Even sometimes when I was a kid, I would lie to myself, right? I'd say, oh, I didn't really like her anyway, right? And you can do that, because what's interesting is if you write the character saying, I felt so humiliated because I had been publicly shamed in front of all of these people, and I knew that would stigmatize me for years, and I would be in therapy. Those are very adult thoughts looking backwards, right? It's okay if you write as a teenager, you can lie to the reader, you can lie to yourself, and the reader will pick up on it. So when you say, this horribly humiliating thing happened, but it didn't really bother me. I just, went home and then I, yelled at my little sister or something. And the reader will go, oh, look how he's reacting. So you're trying to just write truthfully if you're going to write YA, because, always remember that you're writing about someone else's experience, what someone else is experiencing right now. And so when you were a teenager and you went to your parents or your uncles or aunts or older people and you said, here's my problems, they would always tell you, well, here's what you need to do. And they would always be wrong, right? Because they didn't understand what you were actually going through. And so if you write YA from the standpoint of your adult self looking backwards, that's what you're doing. You're just being the adult in the room, giving them lousy advice because you don't understand what they're really going through. And by the way, my first draft of Spellslinger, the first book, I did that all the time. I kept writing from that adult perspective and it wasn't working. I had to go back. And that's when I say I had to go back to the moment when I was in the hallway before the first bell and I'm seeing everybody else and I see how special everybody else is and I don't feel special. And then I have to ask myself, what do I do next?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Question before last comes from the audience who want to know, do you honestly think young starting authors have a chance nowadays when fewer people read books and there is unfortunately less interest as a society in books or literature?
So the short answer is yes, I do think there is a chance. Absolutely. More people are actually reading now than were reading a couple of years ago. Some of the data seems to be showing us. None of it always. So my first book deal was in 2012. My first book came out in 2014. At that point in time, everybody said to me, oh, nobody reads books anymore. You can't break out. There's too many books. There's too many famous authors. It seemed impossible. Everybody was saying, you can't get in the traditional way. And I did. And so did lots of other people. So it is possible. It always feels like it's going to be impossible. It will always, and if you read authors from the 1940s and 30s and 20s, they were being told it was impossible too. What you need to become a successful author, one of the things that you need is you have to be, not inside, you don't have to be more arrogant, but outside, you have to be a little more arrogant. You have to seem like you believe in yourself. Because otherwise, of course it looks impossible. It always looks impossible, but it is possible. I promise you, there's so many people out there who have gotten book deals who are not as good as a lot of people watching this right now. So long as you write something worth reading, and that means writing what you love and with as much passion and power as you can.
Okay, and on to our last question of the night. What's next in the adventures of Sebastien de Castell?
Well, I'm finishing a novel right now, a second draft of a novel that's like all my novels is overdue. As an editor, you'll love me saying I'm late on most of my books. But for big adventure, it's so hard. The pandemic is so hard for me because my wife and I travel all the time. It's our favorite thing to do, and it's very hard to travel right now. But I'm trying to turn writing a book into an adventure. And a few other authors and I have been talking about going to Venice for a month next year and writing sword fighting novels set in Venice. And so spending a month where we get up every morning and we sword fight a little bit and we go and explore. And then in the afternoons, we write our novels. And so that's the adventure I most want to have. That's always been the dream for me, is to go somewhere interesting, immerse myself in it, and write a novel while I'm there. So that will be my next big adventure.
Yes, COVID willing.
COVID willing, yes.
Okay, so thank you very much, Sebastien. It was truly a pleasure.
Likewise.
And thank you also to the viewers at home. After this interview, we will have the ceremony for the writing competition.
Yeah. I'd like to thank Sebastien too. It's been great, and it's been a pleasure to speak to you. I think for Nadav, it's been a pleasure to speak to you. It's been a pleasure for me to hear you. Thank you so much for joining us in this late hour. I don't know how much you've got left to sleep tonight. So.
Oh, that's okay.
And read the Spellslinger series. Laugh out loud. Disturb people on buses.
Thank you both. It was a real pleasure for me.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good night.
Good night.
טוב, זהו, נשארנו כאן אנחנו.
כן.
אז ממה נתחיל, נדב?
רגע, יש לי את היכולת לחלוק מסך?
מה זאת אומרת? אני רואה את שנינו. האמת שאני רואה את שנינו, שנינו מופיעים. אבל יכולת לקבל את המסך לעצמך, אני יכולה לשתוק. אתה רוצה להראות את דברים.
נכון.
אני חושבת שעכשיו אתה יכול.
בוא נראה, כן. איך זה עובד? יפה. אוקיי. אז ברוכים הבאים לרגעים האחרונים של האירוע שלנו, ולהכרזת הזוכים בתחרות פרס אלמוג 2021. לזכר רם אלמוג, אבא שלי. זה היה רעיון ארוך, אז אני מציע שנתקדם כבר לזוכים שחיכו הרבה זמן בשביל לגלות מי הם.
התענגו על הזמן הזה, נדב.
מה זה?
התענגו על הזמן הזה, זה היה רעיון.
התענגו, כן, התענגו על הזמן הזה. אוקיי. אם כך, without further ado, המקום השלישי, הסיפורות, הזוכים במקום שלישי, הן. התוכנית הרב-שנתית להארכת חיים מאת אלמוג חנוכר. סיפור מדע בדיוני, מאוד נחמד, מאוד התרשמנו ממנו, ואנחנו שמחים להודיע על זה. המקום השני. המקום השני, הייתה לנו פה דרמה גדולה בצוות השיפוט, ובסופו של דבר כרגיל היינו צריכים למצוא איזושהי פשרה שתספק את כולם. אז המקום השני הוא הן. מטילדה אהובתי מאת מרים וייטמן. אבל גם א' מאת דורית דוד לוי. במקום הראשון, אדריכל צייר מאת שגיא פלד. אני מברך את הזוכים ומודה להם, אני מברך ומודה לכל המשתתפים והמשתתפות. כרגיל היו המון, והשנה נאלצתם להתמודד עם אתגר נוסף, כשנתבקשתם להימנע מסיפורי מוות, התאבדות, תקיפות מיניות וכן הלאה, ולעבור לדברים קצת יותר משובבי נפש, ועמדתם באתגר הזה בגבורה. מעבר לזה, כלומר מבחינה טכנית, כיוון שהאירוע מועבר בזום, ולצערי הרב אני לא יכול לתת את התעודות ביד ואת הפרסים ביד, מה שיקרה הוא שיצרו קשר עם הזוכים והזוכות לאחר מכן. כספי הזכייה יועברו לזוכים והזוכות, וגם תעודה בקובץ דיגיטלי שתוכלו להדפיס, או אם במקרה נוכל להעביר את זה מיד ליד, אז כמובן שאני אשמח להעניק את זה אישית. אז זה הכל, תודה, ולהתראות בשנה הבאה.
נהיה לפני להתראות, נדב, אתה יכול להחזיר לי את המסך?
כן.
אתה יכול להחזיר לי את המסך? אני לא מספיק. יפה. אז אני רק אכריז שהזוכה שלנו באתגר 30 יום של כתיבה, זו ורדית שטרנבך, את מוזמנת בשנה הבאה. ורדית, את מוזמנת בשנה הבאה לכנס שבעזרת השם, שאלוהי הקורונה יעביר כבר את העונש הזה, נעשה אותו בלייב. את מוזמנת לשם עם עוד חבר, חברה, מי שאת רוצה, זה כרטיס זוגי. תודה רבה לכל מי שהשתתף באתגר, ולכל מי שהשתתף בתחרות, ולכל מי שצפה איתנו בראיון, ולכל מי שיצפה אחר כך בראיון. בעזרת השם אני מקווה שנצליח באמת להכניס את ההקלטה לאתר. נתראה בשנה הבאה בעזרת השם בלייב. תודה רבה לכולם. להתראות. תודה רבה נדב על הראיון.